The harsh inland of the Australian continent. It's still hard to imagine it as a subtropical rainforest ruled by dinosaurs. But the evidence is there. Evidence that so far has told us that at least 8 different species of dinosaur once roamed the land. Evidence that each year, through the painstaking work of paleontologists, is revealing more and more species and shedding new light on their origins, diversity, and eventual demise. For most of the last 30 years, the single discovery, which was considered the most spectacular of all, was made in central Queensland.
Well, the Muttaburrasaurus, there's a story. July 1961, I was mustering cattle down along the Thompson River. Been a fair bit of rain the night before, and it washed the dirt and dust off the rocks and from around the rocks. I noticed an outcrop of sandstone, or rock, which it really is, sort of sprung to my attention. So I decided to ride over and have a closer look. The first thing I noticed after having a look at the outcrop was the uniformity of it. When I had a good look at it and saw the size of it, I knew I was jumping onto something, definitely something big, you know, crikey, you know, I'd never seen nothing like this before. So then you could see where the vertebra was obviously the part of the backbone, the vertebrae, you know, it led on back into the stone. You could see where it was sort of all laid out into the main pile of rocks. So I decided I'd send it down to the Queensland Museum. In due course, I had a letter back saying, could I photograph it? Oh, right, so the Landsborough and the Thompson were both running by this time. So anyway, I swam the old pony in and photographed it all and had the print developed, and even in our prints we could see, especially you could see part of the backbone. Right? So I sent it down to the museum and they enlarged it all, and well, from their prints you could really see we had something, you know, the jingies. And so in due course they came up and decided they'd do something about it, come up and dig him up. Then it went, of course, they took it back to Brisbane and they kept me informed on it. But, well, that was sort of the end of the story with me, and there was Muttaburrasaurus langdoni, and that was, well, that's as far as it went with me.
Until recently, Muttaburrasaurus langdoni was Australia's most complete dinosaur fossil. Work on interpreting its behaviour and appearance has been carried out by Dr. Ralph Molnar of the Queensland Museum.
The adult Muttaburrasaurus was about 7 meters long and stood about 3.5 to 4 meters tall. And Muttaburrasaurus was a plant-eating dinosaur. The hind limbs of Muttaburrasaurus were large and robust, and when the animal was in a hurry, it probably walked on the hind limbs alone. However, when it wasn't in a hurry, it probably came down and walked on all fours. But when it was feeding leaves in a tree, it doubtless reared up on its hind limbs again. The most obvious feature that makes Muttaburrasaurus such a unique Australian dinosaur is this great bulge on the snout. Now, this is actually a kind of bony balloon with thin walls of bone surrounding hollow internal chambers. This probably acted as a resonating chamber to make the voice deeper. It may also have housed sensory tissue to enhance the sense of smell. Muttaburrasaurus was probably a herding animal and used calls to communicate between different individuals of the herd. In the juveniles, this chamber would not have been as well developed, and they would have had a call with a higher pitch.
The juvenile Muttaburrasaurus, like most young animals we know today, was probably playful and inquisitive. In this case, the mother's desire to rest results in her youngster wandering off alone. He now faces the trials of an unknown environment without the protection of the herd.
Pterosaurs were the biggest flying creatures that ever existed. The largest one that we know of was found in the southern United States, in Texas, had a wingspan of about 14 meters. Now, a relative of this animal was found in Western Australia. It was found about 30 years ago, but it was only recognized in about 1990. The most recent pterosaur discovery, however, has been in Queensland, which is the snout of a pterosaur. You can see the teeth along here. These were actually interlocking teeth, somewhat like that. They suggest that this creature was actually feeding on fish. However, one would expect that these animals would also act as scavengers as well. Most animals that eat flesh also scavenge. After all, a free lunch is always welcome. And these probably scavenged on the carcasses of marine reptiles that washed up upon the seashore. "100 million years ago, there was a seashore here in the vast interior of Australia, which at that time was an inland sea. 7 million years later, it was covered by sandy sediments hundreds of meters thick, caused by massive volcanic eruptions. At that time, this landscape inhabited by dinosaurs had huge pine trees growing up to 20 meters in height. The annual rainfall was thought to be as much as 1 meter. Over the last 20 years, Dr. Mary Wade of the Queensland Museum has devoted much of her time to interpreting the evidence of a dramatic incident between dinosaurs that took place here at Lark Quarry, just half a day's drive from Muttaburra. This was first discovered by the manager of a nearby grazing property, who was prospecting for opals. But instead, his efforts led to this. These prints remain a fleeting record of the only stampede amongst dinosaurs found anywhere in the world.
We were looking at around about a minute, a genuine minute. that was well over 90 million years old. At the time, we thought of it as a 100 million year minute, but we had to admit later on, as geological dating got better, that it was only 93 million year old minute, but it was still a minute. And to people who regard 500,000 years as an instant, a geological instant, one genuine minute, it was absolutely mind-blowing.
In total, 3,300 tracks from at least 3 different species were uncovered. They'd been made in the surface of a half-dried muddy creek, which flowed out into a lake. Here its sediments formed a small point where creek and lake met. Most of the tracks were made by the small bipedal dinosaurs, running as fast as they could in the mud. There was, however, something else.
The big tracks belong to a carnosaur. He's a meat-eating dinosaur, about the size of an adult Muttaburrasaurus, and he could have put away anything else that was in the stampede. At one point, we can tell that the big dinosaur was thinking about something. He hesitated, he looked around, put his foot down very softly, and then he moved on. But he still wandered a bit, as if he was looking from side to side and weighing out where he could best block the small dinosaurs coming back from the point. Suddenly, he veered off to the right and presumably cut them off again, but that, of course, is pure guesswork. The rocks are eroded.
While Lark Quarry has provided an extraordinary insight into just one moment in time, other excavations are also revealing more about the marine creatures that once inhabited the seas buried beneath these sandy sediments.
One of these was the plesiosaur Wollongosaurus. We have a skull of Wollongosaurus right here. This is the region of the eye, and these are the teeth. The teeth were interlocking, like the pterosaur teeth, good for catching fish, rubbery cephalopods, squid-like creatures, these sorts of things.
When Muttaburrasaurus roamed the land, one of the largest marine reptiles was the plesiosaur. Despite its size, it would come ashore to lay eggs like a turtle, risking encounters with land-based predators. In southeastern Australia, in a small inlet which has been given the name Dinosaur Cove, several new species have been found. When the inland sea was being covered by sediments, what was once a valley here was flooded by the sea we look at today. The valley, it now appears, was home to species of dinosaur that had become extinct elsewhere in the world. Now, paleontologists are having to use a number of innovative techniques to excavate deep into the soft cliffs where the fossilized bones remain.
We have more or less gone around some of the richest ground, going deeper, drilling tunnels in deeper. And we've left this one pillar behind of rock to support the roof. But it turns out that that's the richest area of the whole excavation. So what we did last summer was to build a replacement pillar. We found dinosaur bones all around it, we found the two skeletons that have come from southeastern Australia, come from within 2 meters of that rock pillar that we're trying to get. So we've got about 15 square meters of prime real estate.
But to access that prime real estate is both difficult and dangerous. Once the tunnels have been dug deep into the cliff, carefully placed dynamite charges are laid to blast off the overburden. The aim is to lessen the risk of the overhang collapsing on the excavation team. The fossils themselves are well clear of the charges and are unlikely to be damaged.
The dinosaurs that come from here are primarily two types. The most common are kangaroo-like dinosaurs called hypsilophodontids. Now, these dinosaurs range in size here from about bantam chicken size to about adult human size. Like kangaroos, they're herbivorous. The only difference is that they wouldn't have had obvious ears, and there would have been no fur.
Predators such as Raptor were amongst the fiercest species that a young Muttaburrasaurus might encounter. But the survival of dinosaurs was dependent on much more than their ability to attack or defend. As with modern-day animals, feeding strategies themselves were just another aspect of dinosaurs' adaptation to the total environment, on which the survival of whole species depended. In comparison to their overseas relatives, the unique features of Australian dinosaurs are no doubt a consequence of their adaptation strategies to a different environment. Now, new discoveries are leading some paleontologists to consider the idea that when the continents were joined, dinosaurs from Australia may have spread to what became other parts of the world.
In this collection of Russian and Mongolian dinosaurs, we have an example of relatives of Muttaburrasaurus, the duckbills. They survived by feeding on different kinds of vegetation and feeding at various levels in the vegetation. Corythosaurus had stacks of teeth, and those teeth were used to crunch up very rugged vegetation. Now, Corythosaurus would have fed in the forest vegetation at about my height, but its near relative that had similar teeth would have fed much higher up in the forest canopy, Its name was Saurolophus. And it was very, very closely related to Muttaburrasaurus. While the duckbills in this collection are about the same age as Muttaburrasaurus, there are dinosaurs in this country that are much older than they are elsewhere in the world. This Protoceratops from the Gobi Desert in Mongolia is 75 million years old. At a locality near Inverloch in Victoria, we have a near relative that's more than 100 million years old.
Usually covered by the sea, this site has to be excavated during the 5 or 6 hours of low tide. The first job is to expose the rock formations in which the fossils are found. Then, larger pieces of rock are removed and carried further up the beach. Here, they can be broken up to reveal smaller fragments of bone.
Hit barely with a hammer.
It doesn't come out the other side, which is a good sign. It means that we've got all of it, if it is bone. Oh, there's a bit of bone.
Our finds here at Inverloch are making us think this area may have been the birthplace of several groups of dinosaurs, because their remains occur here much earlier than they do elsewhere in the world. An example would be the ostrich-like dinosaurs and maybe the horned dinosaurs, the ceratopsians.
The other thing to remember about this area, though, is also a refuge. It was a place where things persisted long after they become extinct elsewhere. For example, we have a very large group of amphibians which had become extinct, we thought, a decade ago, 100 million years earlier, and here they're persisting in Australia in this polar climate long after they'd become extinct elsewhere in the world. So it has these two aspects about this locality.
Look at the whole thing. Beautiful.
Yes. Oh, what's that big one?
Uh-oh.
It's quite close.
No, that's just more plastic. That's okay.
Yeah.
No.
Over
Nice and shiny, must be a tooth. I wonder what. It's
I
not obvious
don't
what.
know.
No, it's not obvious what it is.
This tiny tooth subsequently turned out to belong to yet another species not previously recorded in Australia, a relative of Ankylosaurus, which also lived at the time of Muttaburrasaurus 100 million years ago.
And something that's very interesting about these sites in southeastern Australia and also in western Queensland is that we know so little about the dinosaurs on this continent that work in the next decade or so is very, very likely to produce internationally useful information about origins and evolution of dinosaurs in Gondwana and in Australia specifically.